Look, thank you very much, Abdul, and organizers for inviting me here to join you today, and my greetings to the other participants, some of whom I know very well, but haven't seen in quite a long time. I'm going to share some reminiscences as a journalist who met Massoud in Afghanistan. But first, I wish to make this disclaimer, which is in the interest of professional integrity. If anybody should ask whether or not I was in that group of foreign correspondents who among themselves referred to Ahmad Shah Massoud as the boss, then my answer is yes. Okay, I first made my first visit to Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation in 1984. And at that time, it entailed a 10-day hike through Nuristan, which included crossing at least 4 rather high and difficult mountain passes. Consider for a moment, 10 days walking in meant also 10 days walking out. So 3 weeks of hiking to spend roughly 10 days in Afghanistan. But I have to say, it was certainly worth it. However, that's another story. In 1984, I was traveling with Tony Davis, who was an Afghan veteran of the time, and another Australian, Chris Hook, who was a filmmaker. I was there, Chris is a sound man. We came down out of Nuristan into the upper Panjshir, and just by chance, we ran into Commander Massoud. So we had an unofficial meeting with him. It took place in a small house, and we were basically chatting and having chai. And while we were there, 3 locals came in and sat down and joined us. And presently, Massoud turned to them and said, "What do you want?" And he was polite. And they very amiably said, "Well, we've just come to have a look." And so Massoud said, "Okay, you've had your look." And with that wry dismissal, the 3 lads got up and left. And my first impression of Commander Massoud was developed right then. He projected authority. Even in that little old house, he projected authority. Now, I wasn't sure that the 3 lads had come to see Massoud or had come to see the foreigners, but next I found that Massoud's attention was on me, and he had a question about the boots I was wearing, which were in fact a US Army issue. They were former jungle boots from Vietnam. And he said, "How did you find them?" And without thinking like an idiot, I just answered, "Yes, they're fine." And Massoud then contradicted me, and he said, "Well, our men have found them not to be of much use at all." And so I felt rather foolish, and I realized here was a straight-talking man. Give him a straight answer when he asks you a question. Now, at that time, of course, these days we know Commander Massoud for his excellence in the battlefield. Back in 1984, it wasn't necessarily so well known. In the Panjshir at that time, there were a string of army bases. These were Afghan government bases. I don't think there were any Soviet troops there, maybe 4 or 5. The northernmost base was at a place called Peshgur, and while we were there, Massoud attacked Peshgur. Unfortunately, the attack was a failure, and I believe 2, 3 of his men died in the attack. On the way back to our base, we came across Massoud by chance, and he was weeping. This is quite an extraordinary sight, and it was quite emotional, and I took it to mean that he was sensitive to the loss of life, at least so far as his own men were concerned. He wasn't weeping because the attack was a failure. Now, of course, in due time, Massoud eventually pushed all the communist bases excuse me, out of the Panjshir. And as we all know, he expanded with much improved armed forces, basically an incipient army. He trained his men on an extraordinary scale, and he moved into the north of Afghanistan. And he obliterated most of the Afghan communist posts and bases and garrisons in the northeast of Afghanistan. But there still remained quite a considerable opposition to him. This came from 2 places. One was some rather minor pro-communist militias. These men belonged to groups which were outside the Pacham Kalka division, but there was also opposition from his arch rival Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the leader of Hizb Islami. Because of this, perhaps, I carried in my camera vest 2 Soviet hand grenades for, let's say, self-protection. I always carried these grenades with me, even in the presence of Commander Massoud. His bodyguards didn't like it. Massoud himself didn't object. Now, this raises the question, was he a little bit lax in his own personal security? And of course, I can suggest that his cowardly assassination offers one answer to that question. Just as an aside here, I would say his rival, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, would never allow anybody, certainly a foreign journalist, in his presence carrying hand grenades. When Hekmatyar had Kabul under siege, we could drive out to his headquarters in Charasiab for an interview. And before we got to see Hekmatyar, his bodyguards gave us a very intensive search. Not only that, we had to wind on the film in our cameras. This was in the days before digital cameras. Wind on the film and click the shutter in order to demonstrate that the camera was indeed a camera and not a bomb. Now, I'd said that Commander Massoud projected authority. In my experience, he didn't flaunt that authority. And I'll give you this example. In the north, I think 88 or 1989, there was a Hizb Islami commander by the name of Zadod, who ambushed a number of Massoud's commanders who were returning from the conference. Later, Massoud captured Zadod, and I happened to be present, it might have been Talokan, when Zadod was in custody of Massoud, and I asked him for permission to go and interview Zadod. Now, Commander Massoud was the senior authority. He could have just ordered Zadod brought out to speak to me, but he didn't. What he said was quite extraordinary. He said, yes, you can speak to Commander Zadod, but only on the condition that Zadod himself agrees. Now, just in case you think Massoud was a little bit soft, I should add that probably in the following year, he had Zadod executed. Now, everybody knows by the turn of 1992, the Mujahideen collectively surged on Kabul. It was the defeat of the Russians and the defeat of the Afghan communist regime. It so happened that in 1992, I returned to Kabul myself, and I was employed by the French news agency, Agence France-Presse. Now, we all know that about the problems the Mujahideen had fighting among themselves, the factional differences. I had a few problems myself reporting on these differences, sometimes from the front line and sometimes from interviews that I conducted. One interview in particular with Massoud, his house was just up the road from mine in Kabul, his main guest house. So he called me up one evening for a chat. And I'll have to say it was a run-of-the-mill interview, but he made some rather astonishing remarks, in fact, some derogatory remarks about his rival Hekmatyar, which I reported. That got me into some rather hot water. It wasn't Massoud himself who complained, but some Jamiat figures. Anyway, that soon blew over. However, there was one time, one interview when I got Massoud very riled up. It was after the Taliban had taken Kabul and the entire Rabbani government had retreated to the north. I think they more or less set up an unofficial headquarters in Talokan. Anyway, I flew north to Talokan to interview Massoud, and I was astonished to learn, in fact, that his main concern wasn't that he was forced out of Kabul, but he was complaining about Pakistani support for the Taliban, outside interference. Frankly, I thought he was probably happy to be gone from Kabul. He didn't have all the worries that went with it, including signing chits for 20 liters of fuel to every commander who had a vehicle. Anyway, I was concerned that Massoud was in the process of negotiating an alliance with the Hazaras and also with Uzbeks under General Dostum. And I reminded Massoud that Dostum, who was formerly a Massoud ally, had switched sides, joined forces with Hekmatyar in 1994 for the attempted coup, which of course was a failure, although it was a very close run thing. And I made a big blunder here, a cultural blunder. In saying this, I said to Massoud that perhaps he was moving like a snake in the sand from side to side, and I made an undulating motion with my hand. And my interpreter, recognizing the potential insult here, actually didn't go ahead and translate. Massoud, having noticed, insisted that the interpreter explain, and he did so. And Massoud's face changed. I have never seen such dark emotion in the commander before. He was very angry. I needed a deflection. So very quickly, and I had another question up my sleeve, and I'll just quickly take an aside and give you the backstory to this question. On the second day after the Taliban had taken Kabul, I decided to do a run up the old road to find out basically where Massoud's troops were, how far the Taliban themselves had advanced. So I took off with my driver, and the road was lonely and deserted. So much so we got to a point I said, stop. I mean, we didn't know where we were, and I didn't want to run into an ambush, or in fact, perhaps the road had been mined by Massoud and we get blown up. We waited by the side of the road. Then I heard it, chanting, Taliban chanting. Up came a convoy of Taliban, and they drove all the way up to Charikar, totally unopposed. We drove with, excuse me, we drove with them, in fact, drove into Charikar, which they then occupied. The point is, on the way back to Kabul, we encountered absolutely no Taliban whatsoever. The entire highway was open. So, back to the interview in the north, I said to Commander Massoud, you know, Commander, why didn't you mount a commando assault on Kabul shortly after you were pushed out? I said, a couple of tanks and a few good determined men, you could have pushed all the way into Kabul and wiped out the Taliban leadership. And he turned to me with a smile and he said, yes, we had the tanks. We were just lacking those few determined men. And that remark really impressed me. And it was frank. It had, of course, it showed the commander's sense of humor, but to my way of thinking, it portrayed a superior and very rare quality, which is grace under fire, grace under fire. Anyway, my time, of course, soon came when I had to leave Afghanistan. In fact, I was kicked out of Afghanistan by the Taliban. Ironically, they had accused me of spying for Massoud, which, of course, wasn't true. But it was true that we had a satellite telephone connection with Massoud. We could speak to him in the north. The connection wasn't always good, but you could do it. And sometimes the commander would say something like, well, Safed Khan, tell me, how many tanks would you say do the Taliban have in Charikar or Jabal Sarraj? So he was quite a character. The last word, I would like to say, we all know Commander Massoud's record of accomplishment in war. And I think it'd be fair to say that given peace, his accomplishments in developing the future of Afghanistan, its progress, and equality and rights and so forth would be even much greater. Thank you very much.